going to move to the next presenter, and he is Dr. Alf Lategan. Dr. Alf is a private veterinarian on animal production in Jeffreys Bay. Has been there for a couple of years now, and he specifically is focusing on dairy. And he will give us a presentation on the vet's role in optimal and applied reproduction. Dr. Alf, welcome, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Eliane. It's great. Hi, everybody. I see there's quite a few of you guys. I've listened to the last bit of Prof. Lawrence's presentation, and I think it's a very good segue into what I was about to say. But I think the bottom line is, as you said, we're not nutritionists. In a sense, we're really not anything, but we know of so many things, and so we're pretty much very well positioned to bring all the loose ends together, be it nutrition or be it reproduction or be it whatever. So few of us will ever become reproduction specialists, and but you know enough of reproduction to actually help the dairy quite a bit. So yeah, I think there's so many potential little different aspects. I mean, there's people just focusing on data, as you guys have been. I'm sure you've had the presentations before. So every single little aspect is something one can focus on. But I think you need a vet that's well positioned and that knows the dairy farming enterprise specifically, that can bring all those loose ends together, even though you're not a specialist necessarily in any one of those aspects. So yeah, I think that's the short and the long of a little introduction. So to give you a bit of a background, my limitations here is I'm not a specialist. I'm just a very much normal veterinarian. My in a sense, problem is that we generally deal with pasture clients only. I'm down in the Eastern Cape in Tsitsikamma, and so we have about 33% of the country's milk is being produced here. And I think we have more than 33% of the cows in the country, milking cows, primarily because they pasture and they don't produce as much. We currently 4 dairy vets in my own practice, so we do a lot of dairy for the most part, although we do enjoy the odd smallie. We're currently servicing about 45,000 cows in my direct area. That's sort of from the Tsitsikamma to the Gamtoos.
Okay, Dr. Alf, sorry to interrupt, but your slide is not moving.
Oi.
Yeah, maybe you must just put it on the big slide and then continue.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing there for a moment, and then I can get my camera on as well if you want to see what I look like. Right. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to try again with the share. Window share. Okay. We look at die leen beweeg ons.
Daar sy. Dis beter.
Hy wil nog nie beweeg by my nie. Daar is hy. Het hy aangeskuif?
Hy het aangeskuif, ja.
Right. Okay, so we can continue. So the pasture, I think, just to give you a bit of a background with the pasture versus the TMR, I only joined in quite late with Prof. Lawrence's talk, so I'm not entirely sure if he's alluded to some of this. But there's a massive difference, and I think the older I get, the more I appreciate the difference between TMRs, and to the point where I actually don't even recognize a TMR cow as it's a bit like a horse for me. That just don't know much about them. But to give you a bit of an idea, obviously with pasture versus TMR, we have a lot of seasonal changes in grass quality, and so this, well, Prof. Lawrence said he likes the TMR primarily because you don't have these changes, but there's obviously a lot of advantage in the seasonal changes in grass quality as well. And the main reason being a certain time of the year, and it's pretty much now from August onwards, we're just flush with grass, and we just can't keep up with grazing all this food that just grows by itself. There's a lot of rainfall in the Tsitsikamma, so there's very little costs involved other than the land. But the grass just grows. And so they typically produce a kilogram of dry matter for less than R1 a kilo, whereas the TMRs is, I'm not entirely sure what it is at the moment, but I'm sure it's upwards of R4, depending on the price of millies. So yeah, the seasonal changes does have its advantages, and so when there's a lot of grass, we tend to try and get our cows to all peak in lactation, so that they can make use of all this available nutrition, which comes really cheaply at this time. But certainly, other times of the year, it's a little bit more challenging when there's just not much pasture on the grass, and you have to feed a little bit extra, especially if it's dry. You don't necessarily know what the mineral content is doing in the grass. You don't even know, what the MEs are doing always. It can be quite challenging at different times of the year. But for the most part, I think the farmers have figured out over the years what's happening in what sort of month, and they'll adjust accordingly. So obviously, in terms of reproduction, we're very much seasonally bound. Our intercalving period needs to be 365 days, else by very definition, a cow will not be in our system. She will just go. From time to time, we'll carry over a cow to the next season, but that would be few and far in between. So our cows aren't giving a lot of milk. I might have some slides on there, but TMRs typically produce more than 40 liters. We're quite happy around 20 to 25 liters on average per day per cow. And so our cows aren't being revved up as much. And subsequently, they're not going to milk for 2 years at a time, which some of the TMR cows can actually do. Our breeding period is just 12 weeks. Obviously, the TMRs, they tend to just roll over, and so it's very much a different situation. I think a TMR cow, I'm not entirely sure, and it probably depends on who you're asking. I mean, you can probably breed those animals up to about 305 or 6 days in milk and still be profitable. I'm sure some cows even later, but it's not going to cut it in the pasture setup. So calving to first AI is typically 42 to 65 days. I've put in brackets there 90 days because the cows tend to calve in a season, and the ones that calved earlier will typically have a longer calving to first AI, and obviously they'll have a much better first AI conception rate. And so, but the ones that calve later will just won't have a 60-day voluntary waiting period because she needs to fit into the system. So she typically gets bred sometime from day 20 onwards. But mostly I'd say people will at least wait, or we'll give them some grace to 42 days. So that's for the cows that calved late in season. So we aim for a 3-week submission rate of 90%. Conception per AI. I know with the TMR guys, they're quite happy if they get a 40%. We're actually generally frowning upon the situation if they're less than 60% in a pasture setup. And that's primarily just because these animals have a much lower production, and so they have a longer life expectancy. I think the average lactation you get from a TMR cow is 2.2, if I'm not mistaken. Your data guys can give you a bit more of an accurate idea. Pasture, it's not the average, but we certainly do have cows that's more than 10 years in milk and gave a calf every single year. So the longevity is definitely quite different because they're just not under as much metabolic pressure as the other guys. And even just estrus or sexual expression is a lot more pronounced in pasture. We tend to rely on visual signs for heat detection. We're not so much automated. We'll perhaps put a little scratchy stickers on the cows or tail paint or KMR kind of thing. But in a TMRs, they just don't show as much heat. So, and whereas the pasture-based cows, because they're not under as much metabolic pressure, they just tend to show heat a lot better. I think we had a Dutch vet at some stage, and obviously they're more TMR prone. And he said for the first time he saw riding marks on a cow right here with us in South Africa. So I think that just brings home the difference between the two a little bit more. Anyway, so what we're about to talk about is the role of the veterinarian, your role in optimal dairy nutrition. Okay, and applied not nutrition, reproduction, and applied and also applied reproduction. And that's obviously a bit of a philosophical question, so I'm not going to give you too much technical details because those you can read up. You've got so much information at almost Burton. Even just a little bit that I saw of Professor Lawrence's slide. If you study that, you'll be fine in terms of technical information. So you can always go back and read up on your reproduction notes or whatever specific aspects. So I'm going to take a little bit more of a philosophical approach and really try and encourage you guys to take some heart and sort of just trust what you know and trust what you've learned, and based on the fact that you can always go back and really find what you need. But you've got enough of a background now so that you have all the balls in the air, which we're always going to drop one or two. But to ultimately answer the question, what's optimal? So, and that's obviously also a question I put on there. What's an optimal exam grade? I'm sure most of you can get a lot higher exam grades if you wanted to, but I mean, it's not necessarily optimal in life. You have to at least go for a run at some stage, do a bit of exercise, and if you might lose a mark or two. But the point is, there's always better, but it's not necessarily optimal, and you're fully aware of that. So, yeah, just you should always consider what specifically is optimal. And I think the veterinarian is the best person. Well, it's very well positioned in order to answer that question of what specifically is optimal. And I'll go through a few slides to try to explain that. So also what you need to consider, obviously, first the farm, and then the herd, and then the cow. So what's optimal for the cow will depend on what's optimal for the farm in the first place. And so you really need to consider, to some extent, what's important, what's the situation for any specific farm. So farms exist for various purposes. So you get big corporate farms, and they will have one owner or a couple of owners and 10 or 20 farms. And then you'll have owner-operated farms, and the purpose of these farms are quite different. All of them want to make money, but the owner-operated farm will typically have a much nicer space in which the manager can sit, and they will typically have a TV so they can watch Olympic Games, or probably not rugby. But Olympic Games is something while they sit and work, and they'll have a nice coffee machine. And so for them, it's more important to have a nice working environment, and they might not be as optimally in terms of geared in terms of finances, because it's a different, well, they've got different priorities. Whereas the corporate guys, obviously for them, it's literally just a matter of bottom line at the end. And they approach things a lot different. So you need to consider the farm and the reason why the farm exists. There's subsistence farmers, and they operate on a whole different level altogether. And if you're going to help them, then necessarily push them into too much data taking and gathering and information. So it depends on what they want. If they want a subsistence farm and they just want a comfortable life with happy animals and a very simplistic sort of way of going about life, and you need to consider that in order to answer the question what is optimal in terms of dairy reproduction. And then obviously with the specific herd, in the pasture and TMR pasture context at least, we will typically have a spring calving herd and an autumn calving herd. We don't want an autumn calving herd, it's just because the milk buyer wants it. So Elian sitting there from MTO, she's part of the problem. But I understand the problem. So otherwise they get too much milk in one time of the year. So we typically will have two herds, and obviously what's ideal for one herd will not necessarily be ideal for the next herd. And again, in the pasture context, the autumn calving herds calve down in a much worse pasture environment, and we tend to supplement them a little bit more. And so the milk production is also different. The curves are different, and you manage these herds differently. From a parasitic control point of view, it's also you manage them different. And we tend to get slightly more metabolic problems in the autumn calving herds than what we do in the spring calving herds, primarily for that reason, because they're being fed a little bit more concentrates, even though it's very slight. But nonetheless, the bottom line is there are differences between the herds, and if you're going to make optimal decisions, you need to consider each and every herd as well. And then obviously you can make optimal decisions for individual cows based on where she fits into the story, and you'll be well positioned. So there's always any product, be it a cell phone or whatever, they've got life cycles. Students have life cycles, people have life cycles, worms have life cycles. But a farm will typically have a life cycle in the sense that you will sometimes have it depends. So let's say there was a dad and his sons are taking over, and they might have a different vision for the farm. And so the farm goes through a bit of a life cycle. They will have different owners, and obviously then the purpose of the farm will change. And so consider also a new farmer will have so let's say there's a new owner. They will typically have a lot of debt because they're just trying to pay off this farm. So they've got liabilities, they've got mortgages to pay, and so their purpose, and they've got a new herd commonly, or typically, and their purpose will be just to stock up on the cows' numbers first, and not necessarily so much data management, for instance, to start with, or they might not be that inclined to want to cull all the animals because they want to stock up on numbers. And so lameness treatment is going to be different on such a farm as what it would be compared to a farm that's well established and that's got a lot of cows and whose reproduction is already up and going quite well. There'll be a farm that's well established and it's been a long time owner will typically be more concerned about things like enterotic bovine leukosis or other sort of erosive diseases, whereas a guy that's just starting out couldn't care less about that. They just want to get somewhere, get the cow numbers up. So yeah, like I said, consider the life cycle of the actual farm as well. And then we've got the same story with managers. That's probably one of the most frequently changing issues we have on a specific farm, in that managers come and goes, and as soon as you get a new manager, stuff falls to the ground, so falls through the fingers, and that ball hits the ceiling kind of thing. It's always a bit of a problem. So consider, if you get a new manager on the farm, what's going to be optimal on that farm might be something completely different from what it would have been 2 months ago with an old manager that's well established. Excuse me. So, and the same for season, and again herd, and then other stuff such as Christmas. Optimal nutrition, reproductive decisions will be completely different when they're on skeleton staff between the 16th of December and the 1st of January. So stuff like that needs to be taken into consideration. So it's not necessarily always the same cookie jar or cookie cutter type answer for any specific question. So now that you've got a bit of an idea what optimal means, so the question is, what's your role? You're going to be out young and fresh, and they're going to let you out into the wild without a proper rehabilitation program, you students. And so the question is, what is going to be your role in terms of optimal? And so obviously context changes stuff. And again, I've alluded to how this applies to a dairy farm. So you need to see the farm in its specific context. And yeah, the point I'm trying to make is the most basic context in which you can consider, first of all, the farm, and then the herd, and then the cow, individual cow, would be the lactation curve. And I'm sure you're familiar with it. So the red, obviously, we have the milk production, and the animals tend to peak. This is a lot less true for heifers that or the first calving. Hello.
Soms 'n koei kry wat daar haar melk sit gekalf hierso, né? Haar melk klim.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that was a question. Eileen, jy kan vir ons uitvind as die vraag was, sal ek hom antwoord. Nonetheless, but back to the context. So context changes stuff. So we need to evaluate anything that you do within the context of a lactation curve. So I'm not sure if you can see my little cursor here, but it's obviously the higher you peak, the more milk you tend to get over the whole of the lactation. And so every sort of economic decision that you're going to make needs to be considered in this context. The lower the body weight tends to fall, so the less parasites you have there, the better your nutrition is, the better quality of nutrition, the better sort of dry cow protocol you have on this farm, and calving protocol and fresh calver protocol and metritis and everything that could potentially affect this sort of negative energy balance at this stage. The more money you'll get in terms of return. If you deworm an animal at this stage, you're probably going to get more of a return because it's going to peak higher than what you would get if you deworm an animal later in milk. It obviously depends on the worm burden and so on, and you'll be the best position to make that sort of decision. But yeah, the bottom line is you always need to consider the context, and consider the context for each and every cow in terms of their lactation, because from an economic point of view, that really is the engine driving the whole situation. Yeah, I've had this slide up, and it would have been nice to get some feedback from you guys. It sucks a little that I can't see you guys and ask questions, but nonetheless, I'll have to just share the answer here. But the question is, what does these two have in common? In the spay wound, is typically the only thing that the client will see is your 3 little sutures at the end of your operation. They don't know what's happening inside, and the same is here on the farm. Typically, you get judged by your ability to do pregnancies. And that may or may not change in the future, but as it stands at the moment, if the farmer gets you to do PDs and they're happy with that, then typically you get judged on that and you'll get called back. So It's definitely worth spending some time getting your PDs done. I know there was a PD challenge just quite recently. I'm assuming most of you probably attended the PD challenge, so I'm not going to head back into that too much. So the vet's role is obviously a lot of things, but there's the day-to-day stuff, and this will typically just get you onto the farm. So there will always be PDs to do. There's always going to be dystopias, there's going to be post-mortems on the farm, and they get you on the farm. And as new graduates, you will typically not get onto the farm and go and sit and evaluate their data. That's probably not what they're going to call you to do. But they might well get you to do a post-mortem. And like I say, if you do a post-mortem and you can sort of worm yourself in there, if there's worms in the carcass, then consider discussing the guy's parasitic management situation. And if there's liver flukes, then consider where it's coming from. Do a pasture walk, and obviously that's where you sort of endear yourself to the farmer and you sort of can work your way in. Once you get to the point where you can do day-to-day reproduction work, obviously it's your role, the vet's role, to try and see when it's sensible to leave a cow, when to treat the cow, to consider other form of economic analysis, whether you can do a marginal cost profit or a partial budget kind of thing. That's not very difficult actually, but you need to know just a little bit about the farming enterprise and a little bit about partial budgeting. It's not a difficult thing. It's literally you're going to spend money here and you're going to get some money back. So, which is going to be more spending or return. And so it's not a very difficult thing, and it's definitely worth just sticking your nose into it. You guys don't have to worry about that too much. The bottom line is just try to do it, at least, and the farmer will help you where you're making a mistake. So he's going to be the first one to pick up a mistake in terms of economics. Don't worry about that. So the point is the vet's role is still going to be PDs. It's still going to be the day-to-day stuff, and it's also going to be what to do with specific cows. So yeah. And again, these are some more regular stuff that the vets do, and it remains the role of the vet to do that. It is the role of the vet to do the dystopias and to consider what to do with retained membranes. I've probably had that question 3 times in the last week, retained membranes, and these would be well-established clients and farmers. I wouldn't have expected that, but they tend to forget from one year to the next. It is the role of the vet to try and manage anestrus and pneumotritis and what to flush with and when to flush these cows and how to identify pneumotritis. And so you guys are well positioned to do that, and don't worry about it if you've forgotten a little bit. You can always read up. That's not the point. So information is always going to be available, but it is the role of the vet to decide what to do with suddenly a lot of cysts if you're doing scans and there's a lot of follicular cysts or whatever, and what to do with repeat breeders. And it's the role of the vet, obviously, to do PDs. So there's a lot of opportunities. So I want to just give you I want to motivate you a little. So when you do a reproduction visit, there's obviously a lot of opportunities that sort of present itself. Now, firstly, it gives you the opportunity to gauge what the general level of management would be on the farm. There's always the old adage or old story that when you drive onto the farm, you can see what the fences look like and the general tidiness, I would say, on the farm. Gives you a very good idea. If you know something about pasture management in our context, if you drive up and the pastures are well maintained, well sort of cultivated, then it gives you an idea of the management on the farm. Whereas obviously if it's not being grazed properly, there's a lot of camps which is overgrown, they're forming canopy and whatever, and then you just know that the management's not going to be that great, and you'll have to adjust your recommendations on that farm, or at least the level of expectation for that farm specifically. So just doing a repro visit gives you the opportunity to gauge the general sort of level of management, gives you the ability to gauge the level of nutritional status, as well as obviously the purpose of the enterprise. You can ask the farmer. They'll always tell you they're there to make money, but if you see a nice flat screen TV in the little control room, then you know it's not entirely true. So yeah, it also gives you the opportunity to identify other problems such as lameness and somatic cell counts. That's probably the easiest thing to do ever. If you're busy with a repro visit, you ask the guy, what's your somatic cell count? And they will either be very proud and say it's less than 200,000, or they'll be a little bit sheepish and start making excuses and eventually give you an answer. But it's such an easy way to just worm yourself in. If you ask them about the calves, what's the mortality? Just are they doing okay with the calves? It's such an easy way to worm yourselves into the into the farm and the enterprise, because there's always going to be calves that are dying, and if you ask them what are they dying of, what sort of problems are they having, and so they'll typically, it's very easy to worm your way in and start to chat about Cryptosporidium or Rotan Corona or whatever, and and then all the associated aspects that goes along with that, such as what are they vaccinating the dry cows with? Are they getting something for rotan corona? Are they, what's the hygiene, etc., etc. So the bottom line is there's a lot of opportunity just with a normal reproductive visit. And it's the role of the veterinarian to, while you're doing it, to ask them about the somatic cell counts, the lameness and the calves and stuff like that, so that you get the context of what's the purpose of the enterprise. You need to get the context of what's happening on the farm so that you can make a proper assessment and do so that the role of the veterinarian gets appropriated. And I think that's the difference also between just being a technician and between adding value. So if the role of the vet ultimately is to solve the farmer's problem, and the farmer's problem might not necessarily be a disease condition, the farmer's problem might be to optimize reproduction, or it might be to optimize economic return or whatever, make profit, more services. So, and like I say, that's the difference between a technician and the role of the veterinarian, because you're just so much better positioned to consider all these various aspects. Okay, so this is actually a lot easier if I can ask you questions. So I think I'm going to skip the slide to some extent. Perhaps it's worth mentioning. So if a farmer, just again to bring home the concept of context, in that it's different for various farms. If a farmer presents 100 cows for an estrus, is that too many? And obviously the context changes. If there's only 100 cows on the farm, then yes, it's way too many. If the guy is milking 10,000 cows, then it's probably very acceptable and exceptionally well done. So if most of those cows have very nice, well-sized corpus luteums, what now? So obviously that changes the context in that they're probably not really an estrus cows, although they're presented for an estrus cows, and so they're dealing more specifically with the heat detection issue. So again, small little context like this makes a difference, and you'll know all of this. You've done enough, so you don't have to worry too much about that. So again, it's a totally different story if most cows are not having any ovarian activity, and then you can start with your fancy programs and read up about the CEDAR program if you don't know it, etc. If cows are returning to heat after AI, then you've done that. And again, you can read up on that. So it's just the main thing is just to get the main problem and to solve the farmer's problem. Okay, so the role of the vet, obviously, in addition to what I've mentioned there, it's also the role of the vet to answer questions. The farmers really do pepper us with questions the whole time. I've literally missed 4 missed calls while I'm sitting here, and I can guarantee you all of them just wanted to ask a quick little question, such as the CEDAR cows are in heat the day after the start of the program, and they want to know whether they should AI. And this is a typical question, so that's why I put it up there. They will typically ask you, why did this cow stop cycling? So the cow, for instance, would have been on heat, let's say on day 20, day 40, day 60 is breeding period, and now the cow has stopped cycling, and a farmer would like to know why. So these are typical questions, and you can read up on them. We're not going to philosophically discuss the technicals around why a cow could potentially stop cycling. I'm sure you guys know anyway, but you can read that up. But it is the role of the vet to answer those questions. And so this is just some typical questions. Why does this cow come and heat every week? And obviously, that might be a cyst type of thing. Another typical question is, will the cow abort if she's inseminated while pregnant? Or what will my conception rate be if I use a CEDAR program? And that's obviously a bit of a loaded question. And you can't always give an exact answer to that because it depends on what the conception rate is to start with. If they've got a really good conception rate, doing a CEDAR program will probably be equally good or perhaps 5% less. And it's also different whether because they will often think they use CEDAR program, so it should be, let's say, 5. If they're used to a 70% conception, it should be about 65. But now they're applying the CEDAR program to an estrus cows, and it's not necessarily normal cycling cows, and so the expectations should be different. So this is a typical question that we really do get on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, we get asked about sick animals. That will also be a very typical question. Farmers will phone in and say, well, this cow is not doing this and this and this. So milk production fell to from 20 to 5 liters. She doesn't have a fever. What to do now? And, you can't solve these type of things necessarily by phone. So just book an appointment. But yeah, that's also the role of the vet, is to answer typical questions which the farmers will have from time to time. So the whole holistic story. I'm sure you've heard the word holistic so many times. The only reason why I'm bringing it up here is to give you a bit of yeah, to motivate you. I think the fact is, you know of all these various different aspects between nutrition and mineral status and bulls and fertility and AI and whatever, heat detection. You can consider all these aspects. Just consider them. You don't have to know everything about each and every single little aspect of them, but just consider them. I think that's the bottom line. So consider the body condition, the mineral status, the data. Again, the data is really nice and helpful, but it's not everything. A bit of clinical sense sometimes goes a bit of a longer way. So yeah, data, the management, the culling, pasture, just consider all these various aspects as you continue. I see I've got about 10 minutes left if I want to leave you guys with 10 minutes of questions. So I'm going to jump a little quicker. A calving distribution in terms of the seasonal herds is probably our single most important factor. So we want our cows to calve early in the season so that they've got a lot of time to be ready for the next breeding season and obviously more time to milk. So, excuse me. So the calving distribution is really important, but I think this sort of gives a bit of an idea. This would be a little bit more ideal. And so you want most of your calves to calve right down in the first sort of week or two. We generally aim to calve 80% plus of our animals in the first 4 weeks. And that way, we've only got a tail of 20%, which is really not that bad. And it's possible there are farms that manage that. The bottom line is that's probably going to be one of your most central roles, would be in terms of helping at least the pasture herds get the calving distribution appropriate. And you can obviously, there's a lot of reproduction that goes in. There's a lot of reproductive planning, nutritional planning, parasitic planning, deworming, that kind of thing, just to get all your cows to calve early on in the season. There's synchronization. Use short gestation bulls for the ones that calve late, for instance, so that you can bring them forward to 2 weeks at a time. So hopefully next year they're in a more appropriate time period, stuff like that. So I think that's probably very important. So yeah, as I've mentioned there on the slide, you can see the aim is first for the calving distribution, and then you can look at individuals. You need to first get all the cows in an appropriate calving distribution, and then you can make decisions for individual cows based on where she is in the calving distribution. So a cow that typically calves first in the first week of the calving period doesn't really need a lot of hormones to get ready. She'll have 80 to 90 days to get ready, or before she gets her first insemination, and she's likely to conceive just because she's had that much time. If management and nutrition is good, those animals really don't need much outside help, additional outside help in terms of reproduction. So she just needs to be observed in heat properly. But a cow, obviously, that calves late will have there's a lot of different decisions which you'll have to make with those. She's probably going to be struggling with endometritis closer to the onset of breeding period, and so you'll have to deal with that. You'll have to deal with probably metritis. She's probably going to need more propylene glycol. She's probably going to be an estrus cow and an estrus cow by the time you need to start insemination. So you'll approach those animals a lot different. And I think this is probably, if you remember one thing from today's talk, consider the barrel theory. You can always Google it. I physically Google it and show them on Google Images to farmers just to bring home a point, because they will sometimes be on about various aspects which they want to change on the farm. But I hope you can see my cursor here. Obviously, this little one, the lowest sort of funky thingy sitting there is would be the rate limiting factor here. But if they now on about, let's say, small little aspects of, I don't know, I can't even think of something quickly. Let's perhaps my next slide will do this. Management is normally the rate limiting factor. So you can implement a lot of fancy stuff and implement very fancy heat detection protocols or automated heat detection protocols or lameness scoring or whatever. You can insert a lot of stuff in there, but there's always going to be something that will preclude that from being the rate limiting factor. So management is typically the biggest issue we have. So the staff turnover is something that affects management, the ability of the manager, the systems and procedures, and obviously the purpose of the farm. So I'm going to jump, yeah. I think the slide brings it home a little bit better. So if feed costs are sitting up there, but management is down yonder, there's little sense in complaining about feed costs. And this is again in a pasture setup that's probably true for the TMRs as well. Even if the feed cost and margin over feed is a lot better, there's always going to be farmers that's not making money because their management is not there. So feed cost isn't necessarily even the greatest limiting factor. It's usually management. And the farmers will agree with this. And in my practice, it's the same story. We can be a lot more profitable if management is better. And I'm a practice owner, so I'm talking about myself here. There's a lot of things I know I should be doing, but I'm just not either getting around to it or I just don't prioritize it properly, and we're losing profit as a result of that. And it's the same story on a management level on a farm. For the most part, I think management is the from a barrel theory, the lowest little barrier we have there. And so the same story here with udder health. You can try and improve the udder health, but if the management's not going to implement it, and this we've had, and you stomp your kop many times. Again, consider the barrel theory, consider what's the biggest issue. Sometimes the biggest problem they have on a farm is indeed reproduction, hooves, or udder health, or whatever, and then you need to improve that. So but if this was udder health, then there's little sense in spending a lot of time on hooves just because you know something more about hooves than what you do about udder health. So go read up about udder health in those cases and take the slow process and help them. Culling, I've got 6 minutes, so I'm going to jump a little bit quicker. Culling, I think, is actually quite important, so I just want to bring home 1 or 2 aspects to you, because the role of the vet is really to consider which cows needs to be culled also. And this is a very typical day-to-day thing, and they ask the vet's opinion about this a lot. So you need to basically stock up with perfect cows. If you consider a TMR system where they have 1,000 little stalls and space for only 1,000 cows, it's a lot easier to consider cow number 233 just isn't optimal. Let's say she has overgrown hooves or any of these aspects are wrong, and then obviously you should consider getting rid of her and just replacing her with a replacement. It's not always that easy, but culling is really important. It's a very good income stream for the farm also. So the bottom line is that if there's a cow on the farm, especially as an established farm, it needs to be an optimal cow. She won't almost ever be perfect, as in this case, but you need to get the optimal, as many as possible, sort of perfect cows on the farm and get rid of the rest. So culling is really important. Perhaps just to give you an idea, this is a little calculation we really use, I want to say daily. If I'm being exaggerating here, then perhaps let's make it weekly. So the cost of replacement heifer minus the end of life slaughter value. So the cost of replacement heifer is typically about 15,000 at the moment. End of life slaughter value is sorry about my dogs. End of life slaughter value is 5,000 rand. So obviously the difference there is 10,000. So what you sort of depreciate in a cow over its lifetime is the 10,000 rand. So obviously we divide it by 2 just because some cows would be more and some cows would be less. Half of the cows would be more and half would be less. And that gives you an idea what the value of a cow is, not selling value. So if a cow dies, you lose the 15,000 rand in total, minus that which production value you've had in thus far. But if you can slaughter her, you're still getting that 5,000 rand worth of slaughter value. And the only thing you're losing is sort of the value of a cow. So you can make a lot of culling decisions based on this little calculation. The cost of replacement heifer minus the slaughter value. In between is the depreciation. So obviously if a cow has 10 lactations down the line, she's used most of her value, and technically speaking, that 10,000 rands value has pretty much been delivered on the farm. But a replacement heifer that dies the day after she calves, or that gets slaughtered the day after she calves, will typically lose 10,000 rand in terms of production value, which you've not been able to hit the bank with. Okay, so the space on the farm, I think I've mentioned that quickly. Again, you guys know about minerals. You're not going to exit onderstepoort and remember the reference values. I had to read up iodine's reference value for liver this morning. So you just read up. But this is just to give you a quick idea. Obviously, if you consider farm 27, this was 2017 and 2018. And if you look at the proportion of cows with inadequate selenium, I've just ranked some of our clients here at some stage. And it gives you the bottom line is there's such a big difference between the years in some of these cows, and look at the difference between the various farms. So these are aspects which you guys can consider and should consider, and that's the role of the veterinarian, and it is important for optimal reproduction. So you don't have to go and necessarily sit and plot this, but you know minerals are important, take little samples, analyze it, and obviously make appropriate decisions for the farmers. This is our specific area. I'm going to jump through this very quickly, but I've divided them up in regions. And you can see that the sort of proportion of inadequate records by region, so in other words, the proportion of cows with inadequate selenium, so all the farms in the Gamtoos area, let's say about 20% of them had inadequate selenium, whereas in Oyster Bay area, almost all the cows had inadequate selenium. So there's big regional differences, there's differences between farms, and so you'll have to just consider that. This shows roughly the same proportion of low manganese. The green, the blue ones would be when none of the cows are low in proportion low manganese. So 0% of the animals are low in manganese. As you can see, this area here is probably really well stocked in terms of manganese. So this is our sort of receptacle area. This is Port Elizabeth, and this area that's Gamtoos, and that's all the way up to Tsitsikamma itself. Okay, so, and the last bit of the role of the veterinarian is obviously a bit of research. There's research in terms of just reading up, and there's research in terms of doing small little on-farm trials. And there's always a space for on-farm trials because it's so different. The previous slide actually shows it. There's always differences between farms, and there's differences between camps. So it's the role of the vet to help guide the farmer just to do those little things a little bit more scientifically. So consider advancements in medicine, consider even management. There's very nice publications which the farmers typically don't actually have access to. Let's say in the Journal of Dairy Science, they had an article about various personality traits which makes for a good farm manager, and it's actually something that's really important. Appointing an appropriate manager on a farm is probably one of the biggest factors. So if you consider some research and you help your clients with that, it's also a bit of the role of the veterinarian, and it's sometimes a little bit nice just to do something other than reproduction. So obviously the research in terms of nutrition, there's always stuff coming out, and there's obviously always new technology. The last little bit, which I'm going to mention quickly, and then I'll allow some time for questions, would be the male fertility. Obviously, it's the purpose of the vet to test the bulls, look at the service capacity, look at the frozen semen quality. Every year we will have problems with frozen semen. Nitrogen will leak out. There will be problems with certain bulls, even though these are highly reputable companies. There's always quality control issues. And so for the most part, the seed reps and stuff will bring some samples, and we'll check them just before they deliver them on the farm. So male fertility management, again, look at the inseminators. Not every farm will necessarily have issues, but it's really important to train the inseminators and look at the conception rate early on in the breeding season, so you can pick up if there are problems and send them perhaps for training. So I think when you guys are going to be graduating, I want to really, again, motivate you. You guys know enough. You've been familiarized with most things, and I think as this position to do that. You've been familiarized with almost every aspect that can potentially be important in terms of dairy farming and beef and pretty much veterinary in general. You really have a good course. So just consider everything, read up about the rest, and I think if you do that, you'll be well positioned. So if you just be a little bit vulnerable in terms, I think just take the middle bullet there, be vulnerable but willing. I think Prof. Lawrence also mentioned, don't come in there and thinking you're about, sort of boast about your qualifications. That's not going to get you anywhere, but just be vulnerable and be willing. And the farmers tend to, in life, people tend to respond well to being vulnerable but willing. Programs can be read up, learn from the farmers, and I think we've matched those. The bottom line is we remain students for our whole lives. Even Prof. Lawrence will say there's stuff that they're still going to learn about. So yeah, I think that's roughly me, Hillian. So you can add value. That's the bottom line. I'm going to stop sharing. So if you guys want to ask questions, you're welcome. Let's see if I can just get my video on. Righto.
Okay, you can post your questions, or you can use the button to raise your hand, and then you can continue.
There's nothing. Maybe we should see who's awake. One of the problems with this sort of platforms is we can't check the students. They're making coffee.
Well, there's one comment here is the student saying, just out of interest, do you ever need to draw a line for farmers in terms of answering their questions? When do you consider suggesting a formal consult so that they don't take advantage of your time? Well,
yeah, that's really difficult. And I think that's a philosophical question which you'll have to answer for yourself. So I think my wife and I have had this discussion quite a few times. I can only tell you what we do in our practice is we try to be available and we try to answer as much questions as we possibly can. We tend to take on calls. I've now have, the phone's not even counting the missed calls anymore. I think it's about 9. So I will phone them all back. I'll try and answer as much as the questions as possible. If I can't answer the question, I will try and book an appointment. But we have a bit of boundaries in terms of when we do go on holidays, I will switch off my phone. I'll actually divert it to my colleague's phone, and he will, when he's on leave, he'll divert it to mine, so that again the clients will have access to at least being able to answer questions. If we can't answer, obviously, like in this case, some of the farmers will send a WhatsApp, and we'll answer them with a voice note. There are some potential legal issues with that. You open yourself up, so just be careful. But I think generally speaking, the farmers really like it, and they really appreciate help more. So most of them will appreciate it. And this might be one or two which tend to misuse these questions. But yeah, they are luckily few and far in between. Small animals tend to be different. So I don't know. Some of the, and I think horses are even worse yet. But the smallies tend to, if they latch onto you, they can become quite a pain. So, but the farming clients, we only have about, I don't know, 40, and some managers, I guess it's a little bit more, but they tend to be very considerate, and they won't ask us stuff at night. They'll just bombard us during the day. Martin, I knew it was going to happen.
What's the weather like down there?
It's lovely today. I'm looking out over the sea sitting here, and it's not a wind in sight. It's absolutely great. So we've had fantastic rains last week, 80 mils or so, and so with the sun that's shining and it's like 25 degrees out, we're gonna have, the grass are gonna really take off now. So excellent.
So often in the practice, what's the breakdown roughly of herds where you just go do the rectal work compared to those where you do some involved consulting?
No, I don't think we have rectal work only. Let me just think if there's such a farm. If there are some farms, it'll be, let's make it 5%, just to be generous. But really, I think the clients at the moment still use us, will typically use us for more than just rectal work. We wormed our way in.
And how many clients have you fired?
A couple. We actually never fired them specifically, but we sort of just kept our boundaries, and they left by themselves. So I think about 3 at the moment, and it's the best decisions we've ever made.
Yes, I'll concur, right? Because that time and frustration you can happily spend somewhere else.
Yes.
So
it's
difficult
in the beginning.
You fired your first client.
We put boundaries for some clients, and if they just don't like it, and then they tend to go. So that's, luckily it's worked for us. But I must say, yeah, it might be difficult in the beginning, especially if you don't have a lot of clients, and that might be the situation for the students.
Sure.
But you bear. Like I said, Ingrid is asking, as a dairy farmer, I really appreciate a relationship of trust with our vets. They are willing to help whether they can, which we value. Thank you. Okay, it's a comment. Thanks, Ingrid.
We do have a remark here
from
Ingrid Engelbrecht.
Okay, I can't see it, actually. Helene, kan je hem laten lezen?
Okay. Okay, from Ingrid Engelbrecht. She's saying, as a dairy farmer, I really appreciate a relationship of trust with our vets. They are willing to help wherever they can, which we value. Thank you.
Can
Martin,
I add to that?
Absolutely.
So I'd say that...
Dr. Alf, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I would say that dairy veterinarians have a unique advantage that they've developed relationships with their clients that you can't develop with a small animal or equine, beef, poultry, right? You got regular visits.
Yeah.
And you almost become a family friend in the end.
Yeah. No, it's very true. I mean, I probably know the dogs' names and the children's names, what they studied, what their brothers used to do of most of my clients. It's absolutely true. And the smallies you don't. You know about the pets, but you don't know them as people as well. So no, it's very true, Martin. You really you get to know the people quite well. There's actually we've been here now 12 years, and there's actually quite a few heart-to-heart conversations which takes place from time to time.
One more quick thing, Alf, can you just touch on the retailing aspect of your practice? Just in 5 sentences.
I guess retail is probably 80% of our income at the moment, and we specifically try to position ourselves that way because you do a lot of clinical work, recommend products, and then they go buy from the co-op. And so we just decided we'd rather be one of those that stock everything, and it actually helped us a lot because we now know the products, which we wouldn't have if we just sort of didn't care about selling, especially Act 36 and over the counter. So does that succinct enough?
Yeah, thanks, Alf.
Thanks a million. Nice to hear from you, Martin. And thanks very much, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your dairy program. So good luck with all that. And good luck with the final exams coming 6 months.